Welcome to Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. These are real events retold as haunting bedtime tales. Let's get into it.
It was February 25th, 1957. A freezing afternoon in Philadelphia. The kind of cold where the air feels sharp against your skin, where every breath comes out as a cloud of steam. A young man was walking through the quiet woods near Fox Chase, a rural patch of land on the edge of the city. This wasn't the kind of place people usually went in the dead of winter. The trees stood bare, the ground was wet with melting snow, and the wind cut through the branches with a hollow whistle. But the man wasn't really supposed to be there anyway. According to some reports, he was checking on animal traps he had set in the woods. Other accounts suggest he was simply wandering, trying to escape the chaos of city life. Either way, he wasn't looking for anything unusual. Which is why, when he noticed a large cardboard box tossed in the brush, his curiosity got the better of him. The box looked like something you'd get from a department store. On the side were faint letters and markings, the kind used for shipping furniture or appliances. It seemed out of place, sitting there in the middle of nowhere. He walked closer, crunching over frozen leaves and branches. The top of the box was partially open, and inside was a blanket, worn and checkered. At first glance, it looked like someone had dumped old bedding. Trash, maybe. But then he reached down, pulled the blanket back, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Inside was the body of a little boy. No older than 4. Small. Fragile. His limbs tucked awkwardly inside the box as if he'd been folded into it. His skin was pale, almost bluish, and his hair, what was left of it, had been hacked at crudely with scissors, leaving uneven patches. The boy's eyes were closed. His face bore faint bruises, his lips slightly parted as though he had once been gasping for air. And despite the February chill, despite the isolation of the woods, the boy's body wasn't frozen or decomposed. Which meant one thing: he hadn't been there. The man staggered back, horrified. But here's the strange part: instead of immediately reporting what he found, he hesitated. Some versions of the story say he was afraid of getting into trouble for checking traps illegally. Others say he just didn't know what to do. So he left the box, left the boy, and went home. It wasn't until the following day, when another young man in the area stumbled across the same box, that police were finally called. And when investigators arrived, they realized instantly this wasn't just a tragic death. This was a mystery that would haunt Philadelphia for decades. The boy had been stripped of nearly everything that could identify him. No clothes. No shoes. No toys or belongings. Just a battered body, a blanket, and a box. Whoever he was, someone had made sure to erase his identity before abandoning him in the woods like garbage. And that was the first, chilling clue: this wasn't just a case of neglect, or an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had wanted this little boy to disappear. The investigation into the little boy's death quickly consumed Philadelphia. Detectives worked tirelessly, but every discovery only made the case stranger. The cardboard box was carefully examined. It had originally contained a baby bassinet sold at a J.C. Penney department store. Investigators traced the box back to a distribution center in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. From there, records showed it had been shipped out to 12 different J.C. Penney stores across the area. Thousands of units had been sold. It was a dead end. The blanket found inside the box offered another potential lead. It was a cheap cotton flannel with a distinctive diamond pattern, manufactured in North Carolina. Police hoped that perhaps the design would be unusual enough to trace. But when they contacted the manufacturer, they learned thousands of identical blankets had been shipped all across the United States. Again, the clue went nowhere. Attention turned back to the boy himself. The autopsy revealed heartbreaking details. He was between 3 and 7 years old, likely closer to 4 or 5. He weighed only 30 pounds, much less than a healthy child his age. His small body carried scars that hinted at long-term abuse. One was on his chin, another on his groin, and still others scattered across his legs and arms. Investigators were particularly struck by a scar on his ankle, the kind you might see from a medical procedure. His fingernails were clean and trimmed, his hair had been freshly cut, but in a hasty, uneven manner, as if it had been done after death. There was also a peculiar injury on his head, consistent with blunt force trauma. That, the coroner concluded, was the cause of death. The washed hands and feet continued to puzzle detectives. It was clear someone had deliberately tried to remove fingerprints or trace evidence, suggesting the killer wasn't just violent but careful and calculated. Police then tried to identify the boy through missing child reports. They checked not only Philadelphia but also surrounding counties and even other states. Shockingly, there was no match. No parents had come forward. No schools reported a missing student. It was as if this child had never existed in official records. To widen the search, the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the city's largest newspapers, took a drastic step. They printed more than 400,000 flyers featuring a photograph of the boy's face. These flyers were slipped into utility bills and mailed to households all across Pennsylvania. They even circulated nationally, reaching as far as other states and into Canada. Yet despite the massive publicity, no one recognized him. Tips did come in, but they often went nowhere. Some thought he resembled a child from a nearby foster home. Investigators pursued that lead aggressively, checking records and interviewing staff. But every child from the home was accounted for. Another tip came from a man who claimed he had seen a boy resembling the victim in the area, but nothing concrete emerged from his story. As weeks dragged into months, detectives began feeling the weight of failure. They were holding the body of a little boy, brutally killed, abandoned in the woods, and no one seemed to miss him. That, perhaps, was the most chilling detail of all. In a city of millions, not a single person had stepped forward to say, "That's my son," or "That's my student," or "That's my neighbor's child." The boy was eventually buried in a potter's field, the grave marked only with a small headstone. Detectives, many of whom had children of their own, continued to visit his grave for years afterward. They refused to let go of the case, keeping his photograph pinned to their desks as a reminder that somewhere out there, the boy had a name, and someone knew what had happened to him. But for all the effort, the case remained cold. And the boy in the box, as the public had now come to call him, was still a heartbreaking mystery. The public fascination with the boy reached fever pitch. Newspapers ran daily updates, radio broadcasts described his injuries and the mysterious circumstances, and every major news outlet in Philadelphia covered the story. Detectives worked tirelessly, following hundreds of tips that arrived at police stations from neighbors, strangers, and even children who thought they recognized him. Every lead was investigated with painstaking care. One of the earliest and most promising leads pointed to a nearby foster home. The home had recently had a few children removed due to abuse allegations. Officers interviewed staff and examined records of children who had been in care, hoping to find a match. The boy's malnourishment and scars seemed consistent with prolonged neglect. However, every child in the home was accounted for. No records matched the boy in the box. The lead dried up, leaving investigators frustrated but not deep. Another theory that police explored involved transient families and traveling carnivals. Philadelphia in the 1950s had a significant population of seasonal workers who moved from town to town. Some suggested the boy could have been the child of a transient worker, perhaps left behind or sold. Officers questioned carnival operators, examined ticket sales, and reviewed census data for transient populations, but nothing tied him to these communities. The boy seemed untethered, existing without a social footprint. The autopsy continued to reveal details that shocked even seasoned investigators. He had been severely malnourished, weighing only about 30 pounds at an age when a healthy boy would have been closer to 50. His scars were consistent with repeated beatings over time. The cut hair, uneven and rough, suggested someone had tried to disguise his appearance after death. Investigators noted the meticulous washing of his hands and feet, an indication that the perpetrator knew how to handle a body to minimize forensic evidence. It was clear the child's death was no accident, it had been deliberate, calculated, and cruel. Police then considered the possibility that the boy might have been deliberately hidden from the world, raised in isolation, or even held captive. They reached out to psychologists and child welfare experts who studied abuse cases, hoping to identify patterns that could explain why he had never been reported missing. Many experts agreed that the boy's injuries and malnourishment suggested long-term abuse in a household that had managed to evade authorities. Still, without a name, a home, or any relatives, the investigation remained in limbo. One of the most puzzling elements was the box itself. Cardboard boxes were common, but this one had been specifically chosen to conceal a child. It had once contained a J.C. Penney bassinet, making it unusual yet not unique. Investigators reached out to stores, manufacturers, and distributors to see if anyone could remember selling the exact box. They traced shipments across Pennsylvania and even neighboring states, but the trail vanished into a sea of paper records and forgotten sales. Meanwhile, the community's fascination and horror grew. Children in Philadelphia began whispering about the boy, and parents warned their own families about strangers and the dangers lurking in the woods. Amateur detectives, journalists, and even hobbyists became obsessed with reconstructing his life. Sketch artists were hired to create portraits of the boy as he might have looked alive. These sketches were distributed alongside the photographs of the body. Yet still, no one could place him. Law enforcement also examined the surrounding area meticulously. Officers checked local trash sites, abandoned buildings, and rural roads for signs of the perpetrator. They looked for tire tracks, discarded clothing, or other boxes that might indicate a repeated pattern. Canines trained in search and rescue scoured the woods for scent trails. Despite these efforts, there was nothing. Whoever had killed the boy had planned it carefully and executed it with precision. Psychological profiles were drawn up for possible suspects. Profilers suggested the perpetrator might have been someone with experience in child care, possibly a parent or guardian. The calculated disposal of the body suggested someone who understood that a child could be discovered and handled evidence carefully. The possibility of a stranger abducting and killing a child at random was considered, but detectives believed someone with a close connection to the boy was more likely. By the summer of 1957, the case had reached a standstill. Police had interviewed hundreds of people, followed dozens of promising leads, and combed every record they could access. Despite exhaustive efforts, no new information had emerged. The boy had no name, no family to claim him, and no traceable origin. His death remained a dark, unsolved mystery. Even decades later, the boy's case continued to haunt Philadelphia and the nation. Advances in forensic science, including DNA testing in the 1980s and 1990s, offered new hope. In the 2000s, investigators attempted to use modern genealogical techniques to identify him through DNA comparisons with potential relatives. Despite technological advances, no definitive match was made. The boy remained nameless, faceless, and tragically forgotten by those who might have known him. The Boy in the Box case stands as one of the most chilling unsolved child murders in American history. It is not only a story of a child lost and killed but also a reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the limits of justice. For over 60 years, the box in the woods has held secrets no one has been able to fully uncover. The child inside had a life, a story, and a family somewhere, but to this day, the world only knows him as the boy in the box. As the years passed, the boy's story never left the public consciousness. Reporters revisited the case, local historians wrote articles, and amateur sleuths combed old records in search of answers. Each new theory seemed more haunting than the last, often painting a picture of unimaginable cruelty. One theory involved a woman who came forward claiming she had a relative, an abusive mother, who might have purchased the boy and killed him in a moment of rage. She remembered the family living on the outskirts of Philadelphia, their home chaotic and violent. Investigators pursued this lead, questioning neighbors, relatives, and anyone connected to the family, but no evidence could conclusively link them to the child in the box. The theory ultimately fizzled, leaving only questions. Another line of investigation focused on the foster care system. Philadelphia in the 1950s had a notoriously underfunded and poorly regulated network of foster homes. Some children were neglected, abused, or shuffled from home to home. Investigators wondered if the boy had been in one such home, never reported missing because no one was keeping proper records. Despite combing through placement logs, interviewing social workers, and tracing former foster homes, no record matched the boy. Even when potential homes were found, the trail went cold. Forensic science offered the first glimmers of hope decades later. The boy's fingerprints were preserved, and in the 1990s and 2000s, investigators attempted to use DNA testing to find relatives. Despite advancements in technology, the boy remained unidentifiable. Every comparison came up negative. He was a ghost in the system, someone who had lived, suffered, and died, yet left no traceable family behind. The boy gained a grim nickname in Philadelphia, America's Unknown Child. It was a title that captured both the mystery and the tragedy. While other cold cases faded from public memory, he remained a haunting symbol of innocence lost. People across the country followed updates whenever new forensic methods were attempted, hoping that modern science might finally solve a decades-old puzzle. What made the case particularly confounding were the contradictions in the boy's condition. His hair had been recently cut, yet his body bore signs of prolonged abuse. His nails were neatly trimmed, suggesting someone had cared for him to some degree, yet he was emaciated, clearly underfed for months or even years. Whoever had looked after him, if anyone had at all, did so in a way that was cruel, cold, and contradictory. It was almost as if he had lived in two different worlds, one where someone performed basic acts of care, and another where relentless neglect and violence were a daily reality. These contradictions only deepened the sense of horror surrounding the case. Investigators speculated endlessly. Could a parent or guardian have loved him enough to trim his nails and comb his hair, yet failed him in every other way? Could he have been transferred from home to home, receiving intermittent care but never safety? Or had he been entirely isolated, occasionally tended to by someone calculating, almost ritualistically cruel, until the day he was left in the woods? Over the decades, the boy became an enduring symbol of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Philadelphia residents passed the story down, police kept the case files open, and every attempt to uncover his identity ended in frustration. Yet the fascination never waned. His case was not just about murder, it was about a life that had existed in the shadows, a child who should have had a family, yet left the world without a name, without recognition, and without justice. For more than 6 decades, the boy lay in an unmarked grave in Philadelphia, his identity unknown. Every February 25th, the anniversary of his discovery, investigators, journalists, and locals would remember him. Flyers with his face, sketches of what he might have looked like alive, and photographs from the original investigation were displayed in schools, community centers, and libraries. Yet, despite the attention, the child remained a ghost, a nameless victim whose life had been stolen in a way that seemed almost incomprehensible. Over the years, forensic experts tried every available technique to unlock the mystery. Fingerprints, dental records, and blood samples were preserved meticulously. Each time forensic technology advanced, the boy's case was revisited. In the 1980s, attempts were made to trace possible relatives through blood type and family medical history. In the 1990s, as DNA profiling became possible, samples were tested against databases of missing children. Every lead failed. Joseph was a puzzle without edges, a child whose life had vanished without leaving a clue. The story gripped Philadelphia and the nation because it symbolized something far beyond crime statistics. It was the story of a child abandoned to brutality, whose suffering was compounded by society's inability to identify him, protect him, or remember him by name. People debated endlessly about who could commit such an act. Was it a foster parent, a neighbor, a relative, or someone entirely unknown? Was it a crime of rage, or a calculated act of cruelty? Experts noted the extreme care with which the boy had been left in the box. His body was wrapped neatly, his hands and feet washed, his hair recently cut. Whoever left him had spent time making sure the crime left behind as few clues as possible. Speculation about his family also haunted investigators. Some believed he had been from a broken household, shuffled between homes. Others suggested he may have been the child of a transient family, with no one in the city aware of his existence. Public fascination kept the case alive. Every time a journalist revisited it, forums erupted with theories, amateur detectives pored over the evidence, and social media in later decades became a hub for discussion. Finally, in December 2022, after 65 years of mystery, modern forensic genealogy provided a breakthrough. Using preserved DNA, investigators were able to trace familial connections through distant relatives. The boy was identified as Joseph Augustus Sorelli, a 4-year-old from Pennsylvania. His parents' identities were eventually traced, though authorities kept their names private due to the sensitive nature of the case. Joseph was no longer nameless, he finally had a name, a marker of his existence that had been denied to him for decades. Even with this monumental discovery, the case remained incomplete. The question that had haunted generations of investigators persisted: who killed Joseph, and why? The crime itself, the circumstances surrounding his death, and the people responsible remained unknown. The box in the woods had given up its secret after more than half a century, but the perpetrators were still shrouded in mystery. DNA confirmed identity, but motive and opportunity remained elusive. Joseph's grave, marked now with his name, became a place for remembrance. Families, historians, and those touched by his story visited, laying flowers, toys, and letters. Social media platforms and local news outlets shared stories about him, trying to restore the dignity stolen from him by a nameless life and a violent end. Communities reflected on the failure of the social system, the foster care network, and society at large to protect him. The case also prompted wider reflection in law enforcement. For decades, the Philadelphia police had revisited cold cases inspired by Joseph's story, examining missing children, unexplained deaths, and unsolved homicides with renewed vigor. The discovery of his identity proved that even decades-old mysteries could be solved with persistence, scientific innovation, and careful investigation. Yet it also reminded the public that while science can reveal a name, it cannot always bring justice. In the end, Joseph Augustus Sorelli's story remains one of the most haunting in American history. A boy found in a cardboard box, beaten, malnourished, nameless for decades, finally identified but still without justice. The boy in the box reminds us of the fragility of life, the darkness humans are capable of, and the persistent hope that truth, no matter how long buried, can eventually be uncovered. Even today, his story continues to captivate, educate, and warn. For every detective, journalist, or curious mind, the question lingers: what happened to Joseph, and will we ever know the full story? His legacy is not only a tragic tale of death and neglect, but also a symbol of persistence, memory, and the quest for answers in the face of unimaginable cruelty. April 1981. The town of Katy, California, was the kind of place most people had never even heard of. It wasn't a bustling city or even a big town. It was tiny. Just a cluster of cabins tucked deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, surrounded by tall pines and long stretches of wilderness. Life here moved at a slower pace. Neighbors waved to each other. Kids played outside until the sun dipped behind the trees. And in the middle of this quiet little mountain community sat Cabin 28. That cabin belonged to Glenna Sue Sharp. Everyone just called her Sue. She was a single mother raising 5 kids on her own. Life wasn't easy, money was tight, the family had been through their share of struggles, but Sue was determined to give her children stability, even if it meant living in a modest cabin in the middle of nowhere. Inside Cabin 28, things were far from perfect, but they were close-knit. Sue's kids, John, Sheila, Tina, Ricky, and Greg, were used to making the best of what they had. The TV in the corner, an old couch with worn cushions, board games stacked haphazardly on a shelf, that cabin was home. By the evening of April 11, 1981, the Sharps had settled into an ordinary Saturday night. The kind of night you'd forget about the next day. Some of the kids were hanging out inside, watching TV. Friends from the neighborhood had dropped by. The older kids chatted and laughed, talking about plans for the summer. It was normal. Comfortable. But outside, as the last bit of light slipped behind the mountains and the sky turned black, Cabin 28 was swallowed up by the kind of stillness you only find in the woods. No traffic, no noise, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For the Sharps, it was nothing unusual. Nights in Keddy were always this quiet. And that's what makes what happened next so unnerving. Because this wasn't the kind of story where danger crept in from far away, where strangers stormed in out of nowhere. No. What happened inside Cabin 28 felt personal. Deliberate. Almost as if someone had been waiting for the perfect moment, when the kids were distracted by the TV, when Sue thought the night was calm, when the whole cabin was relaxed and vulnerable. By the time midnight rolled around, Cabin 28 was filled with the kind of ordinary sounds you'd expect: a laugh from the living room, footsteps padding down the hall, the faint static buzz of the television. It should have been just another Saturday night in a small town. But it wasn't. Because somewhere out there, in the darkness just beyond the glow of that cabin's windows, someone was watching. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, the Sharp family's life would never be the same again. The morning of April 12, 1981, began like any other in Keddy. The sun rose over the Sierra Nevadas, spilling light into the quiet little cabin community, while families moved into their Sunday routines of coffee, church, and quiet breakfasts. But at Cabin 28, the day was already broken. A neighbor who often stopped by noticed something unusual. The cabin, usually alive with noise and activity, was silent. When no one answered the knock at the door, the neighbor grew uneasy. Stepping closer, they saw that the front door was slightly ajar. Inside, the scene was almost too horrific to process. Lying on the floor of the living room was Glenna, Sue Sharp. Her hands and feet had been bound with medical tape, and her body bore the evidence of unimaginable violence. She had been stabbed and beaten, her injuries so severe that it was clear this was not a quick act of aggression but a prolonged and savage attack. Beside her were two teenage boys, Sue's oldest son John and his friend Dana Wingate. They too had been tied up, stabbed, and bludgeoned with hammers. Dana's body also showed signs of strangulation. Blood covered the room, spattering the walls, soaking into the carpet, and streaking across furniture, creating a scene that investigators would later describe as one of the most brutal they had ever encountered. Whoever had done this hadn't simply wanted to kill, they had wanted to obliterate, to leave behind a message written in violence. But as devastating as the discovery was, the most unsettling detail was not who had been murdered, but who had been left alive. As police moved through the cabin, they discovered that 3 of Sue's children had been inside during the entire attack. In one of the bedrooms, Ricky, aged 10, and Greg, only 5, were found unharmed. Somehow the killers had walked past their door and spared them, as though choosing who would live and who would die. 12-year-old Tina, however, was nowhere to be found. Her bed was empty, her shoes were still on the floor, and her jacket hung untouched on the wall. It was as if she had been lifted out of the house in the middle of the night and simply erased from the scene. That detail was what left neighbors, investigators, and eventually the entire country reeling. The killers had slaughtered 3 people, left 2 children alive who could have served as witnesses, and then taken 1 child with them into the night. Why kill Sue, John, and Dana with such ferocity, but deliberately leave Ricky and Greg unharmed? And why remove Tina? The living room of Cabin 28 was so chaotic and soaked in blood that investigators struggled to take it all in. There was evidence of multiple weapons being used, hammers, knives, medical tape, suggesting that more than one attacker had been involved. Whoever committed this crime had stayed inside long enough to tie up the victims, torture them, kill them, and then calmly walk away without being interrupted. This was not random, and it was not quick. By the end of that day, the Sharp family murders had spread far beyond Keddy. Reporters swarmed the town, broadcasting the horror to a nation stunned by the brutality of what had taken place in such a quiet mountain community. Cabin 28, once just another modest home in a remote resort town, was now the scene of one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in California's history. And even with bodies, evidence, and investigators poring over every inch of that cabin, the most haunting question still hung heavy in the air: where was Tina Sharp? Police found multiple weapons scattered around the cabin, knives of various sizes, a hammer with dried blood on its handle, and even a bent steak knife lodged into the floorboards. Each tool seemed to tell a different story, a fragment of the violence that had unfolded. Investigators meticulously photographed everything, dusted for prints, and bagged evidence, but the scene remained chaotic, almost as if whoever had done this had wanted to make it look random, but nothing about it was random at all. The first puzzling fact investigators noted was the lack of forced entry. Windows and doors were intact, locks unbroken. That suggested one chilling possibility: the victims had known their attackers, or at least let them inside willingly. But why? And how could a group of people, presumably friends or neighbors, descend into something so savage? Detectives began interviewing neighbors. The small community had a rhythm that outsiders rarely disturbed. People knew each other by first name, by family history, by routines. Rumors spread quickly, but facts were harder to pin down. One neighbor recalled seeing a dark-colored car parked near cabin 28 the night before the incident, but when police checked, the car was gone, and no one could identify who it belonged to. Another neighbor mentioned hearing voices arguing late into the night, but that was all. Arguments happened all the time in a community of this size. Possible motives were discussed in hushed tones at the station. Personal, not random, that was the consensus. The killings weren't a robbery gone wrong, valuables were left untouched. Nothing about the scene screamed opportunistic crime. The brutality suggested anger, resentment, something far more intimate than money. But with whom? And why? Witnesses described seeing two men in the area that night, strangers, at least to the town. A composite sketch was created and released to the public, but tips were scarce. People who called in were either mistaken or afraid to speak, citing fear of retaliation or suspicion of being wrong. The sketches, crude yet haunting, lingered in the local news and on flyers. Children stared at them in schoolyards, adults whispered about them in grocery store aisles. Despite all this, no arrests were ever made. Detectives chased leads, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed paper trails that seemed promising but led nowhere. Each breakthrough dissolved into frustration. Fingerprints didn't match any known criminals. The two men from the sketch weren't in any databases. The killers, whoever they were, had vanished as if they had never existed. The Sharp family, whose lives had been ripped apart, became a fixture in news coverage. Interviews with surviving relatives painted a picture of ordinary life shattered: a father who had worked nights at a local mill, a mother who baked pies for the church bake sale, children who rode bikes along quiet streets. Their lives had been completely normal, almost painfully so. That normality made the violence feel even more senseless, and yet the underlying suggestion of a personal vendetta kept investigators digging. Over time, small details began to emerge. A friend of the family mentioned a disagreement over land ownership, a petty feud that had grown heated in the months prior. Another relative hinted at a secret affair, never fully explained, that had caused tension behind closed doors. None of these led anywhere conclusive, but they added layers to the STO. A picture of a family and a community tangled in human complexity, where anger and jealousy could fester unnoticed. The media descended, hungry for a narrative. Reporters visited the town, spoke to neighbors, and dug into public records. Every rumor became a headline, every lead became speculation. Locals grew wary, protective of their privacy, but at night, when the wind whipped through the pine trees around cabin 28, the fear lingered. People double-locked doors, checked windows, and whispered about strangers in cars. Law enforcement brought in forensic experts to re-examine the scene. DNA testing was still in its infancy in 1981, but hairs and blood samples were catalogued for future analysis. The hope was that, someday, science might reveal what human memory and witness testimony could not. Yet decades later, those samples remained largely untested, waiting for technology to catch up with the cruelty that had occurred. And then there were the strange reports, details that didn't fit neatly into the narrative. Lights flickering in empty rooms, a neighbor who swore they saw figures moving in the forest at odd hours, and the sense that the town itself was haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. The Sharp murders became folklore, a warning whispered to children. Sometimes the most terrifying things are not monsters, but the people who live next door. Even today, the case remains open. New tips occasionally surface, but none yield the breakthrough investigators desperately need. Cabin 28 stands as a silent monument to that night, doors boarded, windows darkened, the echo of violence lingering in the rafters. The town has moved on in some ways, but the story doesn't die. It waits in the shadows, in conversations hushed at family dinners, in the flicker of a news clip replayed on a rainy evening. Because in cases like this, the most terrifying truth is not just the violence itself, but the questions left behind. Who did this? Why? And why, after all these years? Does justice remain just out of reach? The Sharp family murders are more than a headline, they are a mystery etched into the very fabric of the community, a puzzle with pieces that may never fit. And every time someone revisits the story, they are reminded that evil can strike quietly, personally, and without warning, leaving behind scars that time cannot heal. 3 years later, in the spring of 1984, a hiker stumbled across something that would reignite one of California's most infamous cold cases. Among the undergrowth and fallen pine needles of the Sierra Nevada foothills, partially hidden beneath a blanket of moss, lay a human skull. The jawbone was fractured, teeth missing, and the eye sockets were dark, hollow voids staring up at the sky. Local law enforcement was called immediately, and the news spread through the community like wildfire. Once again, Cabin 28 and the Sharp family were thrust into the spotlight, not for the first time, and certainly not the last. Initial forensic analysis confirmed what the town feared: the skull belonged to 12-year-old Tina Sharp, the youngest of the Sharp children. Her disappearance had been noted at the time of the murders, but with the chaos surrounding that night and the missing bodies of other family members, it had been assumed she perished with them. Now, 3 years later, her remains had surfaced miles away, in a place that had seemed impossibly remote. Investigators quickly noted that the state of the remains suggested something far more disturbing than previously believed. The bones were scattered, gnawed in some places, either by animals or, investigators worried, deliberately mutilated. There were no signs of natural decomposition alone. The positioning of the remains suggested that Tina had been abducted, transported, and killed somewhere far from her home. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, this was premeditated, carefully executed, and terrifyingly personal. The brutality of her murder, combined with the earlier evidence from Cabin 28, led experts to a grim conclusion: more than one killer was likely involved. The original crime scene had already been messy, but now the addition of Tina's remains painted a picture of organized cruelty, coordinated between multiple individuals. The kind of people who could execute something like this didn't just act on impulse. They had motives, grudges, or perhaps darker desires hidden beneath their everyday lives. But the investigation stumbled immediately. The initial handling of the crime scene back in 1981 had already been criticized: photos missing, evidence contaminated, some police reports gone entirely. Now, in 1984, decades-old mistakes made it even harder to piece together the puzzle. Law enforcement had to rely on fading memories, sketchy witness accounts, and bits of physical evidence that had survived poorly in storage. Even modern forensic techniques at the time struggled with remains that had been exposed to the elements for years. Interviews were reopened. Neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances were questioned again, sometimes reluctantly. A few recalled strange sightings in the woods, the sound of voices late at night, cars parked where they shouldn't have been, a fleeting glimpse of shadowy figures. Others, however, refused to speak, citing fear of retaliation or simply the emotional toll of revisiting those horrors. In small towns like this, gossip and truth often blurred together, and law enforcement had to navigate a web of half-truths and long-buried secrets. Rumors swirled about Tina's final hours. Some townspeople whispered about someone seeing her arguing with an older teen the week before the murders. Others spoke in hushed tones of a strange man who had been camping in the woods nearby, but no one had a full description. These fragments of information offered tantalizing leads, yet none were concrete enough to point investigators to a suspect. The forensic team, working as carefully as they could, tried to reconstruct Tina's journey from her home to the place where her skull had been found. Patterns in the scatter of the bones suggested a rough transport route, but it was impossible to be certain. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, moving the body over several miles of dense forest and leaving little trace for humans or law enforcement to follow. The killer's familiarity with the terrain was evident. They were comfortable in the woods in a way most townspeople were not. Meanwhile, the media began to dig, both fueling public interest and complicating the investigation. Newspapers ran headlines about Tina's remains being found, about the Sharp family's tragedy, and about the mounting questions surrounding law enforcement missteps. Some reporters suggested negligence, others speculated about cover-ups, hinting that perhaps the investigation had been deliberately mishandled to protect someone influential. Every story added fuel to the fire, and the town of Keddy found itself grappling with renewed fear and suspicion. As new evidence slowly surfaced, investigators tried to re-examine the original murder weapons and crime scene photos. The knife, hammer, and bent steak knife were scrutinized with the hopes that DNA could still be recovered. But the years had not been kind to the evidence. Blood stains had degraded, fibers had been contaminated, and fingerprints had long since faded. It was a harsh reminder that time, in cases like these, was often the enemy of justice. Psychologists and criminal profilers were consulted. They attempted to map the likely psychological profile of the killers, suggesting that Tina's abduction indicated impulsive cruelty coupled with calculated planning. One profiler noted that the act of moving her remains miles away indicated a desire to distance the crime from the original scene, possibly to confuse law enforcement or to symbolically separate the victim from the family's home. In other words, the killers weren't just committing murder, they were staging terror. The discovery of Tina's remains changed everything for the investigation. It wasn't just about a horrific home invasion anymore, it was now a kidnapping and murder case spanning multiple locations and involving highly organized offenders. Detectives felt the weight of the mistakes from 1981, how early contamination and lost reports had allowed crucial opportunities to slip through their fingers. And yet, even decades later, every avenue seemed frustratingly incomplete. For the town of Keddy, Tina's discovery reopened old wounds. Parents checked locks and taught their children caution. Stories of Cabin 28's horrors became more than folklore, they were warnings. And in quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the pines, residents swore they could still feel the lingering presence of whatever had taken Tina from them. Even now, questions remained. Who was capable of abducting and killing a child so close to home? How many people were involved? And, perhaps most chillingly, did they ever live openly among the town's residents, watching the investigation unfold from the shadows? The discovery of Tina Sharp's remains was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it deepened the mystery, reminding everyone involved that some crimes refused to be solved, leaving only unanswered questions, lingering fear, and the haunting knowledge that evil can move quietly, intimately, and without warning. Decades later, the Sharp case was reopened. Advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence, the knives, the hammer, even the bent steak knife. Names of local men close to the family emerged, one with a history of violence, another with a reputation for threats. Before any could face trial, fate intervened. One died in a mysterious accident, another from natural causes, and a third vanished under suspicious circumstances. Justice remained out of reach. By 2004, Cabin 28 was demolished, but the story lingered. Keddy's quiet streets and pine forests became inseparable from the murders. Children grew up hearing whispers, neighbors recalled shadows, and the case continued to haunt investigators, true crime fans, and the community alike. Even now, the questions remain: who did it? Why? And how could such horror occur in a peaceful town? Cabin 28 is gone, but its shadow still looms over Ketty.
That was another real bedtime story from Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.